Welcome to the BYU Radio studio in Provo, Utah. I'm Julie Rose, host of the daily news interview show Top of Mind, heard weekdays at 5 p.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Channel 143 and BYURadio.org. You're watching continuing coverage of Kerner Plus 50, an examination of race in America 50 years after the Kerner Commission report. The commission, which had been appointed by President Lyndon Johnson, blamed racism and systemic discrimination for fomenting frustration that led urban centers around the country to erupt in violent riots. White society is deeply implicated in the ghetto, said the commission's report. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Today, 1 in 5 Americans believes racism is not a problem in the United States. That's according to a Pew Research survey released last week. And perhaps that explains why it's so hard for us to talk about race in America today. How can we talk about a problem not everybody agrees even exists? I'm joined in studio by LaShawn Williams, a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. She teaches and writes about cross-cultural interaction. Welcome, Professor Williams. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
When somebody in America today says racism doesn't exist, that it's not a problem at least, can you put yourself in their mindset for a moment and help us understand what's going on from that point of view?
Oh, for sure. The visible markers of de jure racism are gone. We are comfortably integrated through entertainment, through sports. Our schools are integrated. Our work environments are integrated. We're not seeing the blatant separation. But what we're also not seeing is the invisible separations that continue to divide us and are founded and contributed to by ongoing systemic racism.
So people who say racism is not a problem in America, are they defining racism differently?
Yes. They focus on racism as specific, intentional, direct, blatant, obvious acts. Because we are not seeing, or at least we weren't seeing, marches of white nationalists or Nazis or the KKK, it was then believed that racism was now not a problem. So because we're not seeing it the way that we're used to seeing it from the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, then it, as it was exampled then, must no longer exist.
Give me an example of something that, an instance of racism that someone who believes it's not a problem is not seen. What are they missing exactly?
Well, racism is a system of advantage based on race. Most of our isms, most of the nationalism, capitalism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, anything ending in ism helps us to remember that it's a system of advantage based on whatever the prefix of the ism is. And so racism is a system of advantage based on race. What we don't see is how racism was built on access to resources and how resources meant power. Power in our country and resources in our country is based in land. And land is where you live, and where you live influences where and how you go to school. Your schools then influence what types of job opportunities you have, and then your job influences where you're able to live, so that we don't see those invisible power structures that are heavily influenced by racism as a system of advantage based on race.
So, Professor Williams, you live in a predominantly white community. You're
Yes.
African American. How do you respond when someone says to you, well, America elected an African American president?
Yes.
You're a successful college professor.
Yes.
Skin color doesn't matter. How can you say that it does matter when
Right.
when people like you can have the success that you have?
Absolutely. A number of well-intentioned white people will see me and President Obama as exceptions to a general rule. And when we focus on the exceptions, we then forget to look at the masses that are not President Obama, that are not African-American college professors, that are not African-American celebrities or athletes or actresses or actors. We then absolve ourselves from the responsibility we have to each other to make sure all of us are able to access opportunities in an equal way.
Tell me a little more about that. What is it that we're absolving ourselves of?
The responsibility to say, what if racism actually is a problem? Then what does that mean? That's the question that we don't know how to answer. That's the question that we're scared to discuss, because then we're personally implicated in the continuation of a system that we feel we did not put actively into place.
We're scared to discuss it?
Absolutely.
Is that one of the reasons why you think talking about race is so fraught in America, and so many people, white people, I'm speaking from that perspective primarily in this moment, are just afraid to bring it up? It's
sure.
like, if I talk about it, then I might either say something wrong, but you think the fear is deeper, that it's subconsciously we're afraid we're going to find something out that's really uncomfortable for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the things that a lot of my white friends struggle with is not knowing who your own heroes were who stood up against racism. You think about Bill Moore, the postman from Mississippi, who was on a 2 or 3 day walk that he wanted to walk from Mississippi to Washington, D.C. to deliver a letter to the president at that point in time, was killed by white members who supported the KKK because he was fighting against racial justice. And he was fighting not because racial justice was bad for black people, or racism and discrimination was bad for black people. He was fighting because racism is wrong. And that's a lot of the issue that I think we run into, is we think we should fight something because it's bad for someone else, as opposed to fighting it just because it's a wrong thing. Racism, white supremacy, those things are wrong because of how they influence people. But even if you're not around black people, or if you're not around people of color, you're not around folks that are negatively impacted by racism or oppression, you should fight it because those things are wrong and they go against your personal moral values. And I think we're scared to actually have that attachment to ourselves, that it being, this is a personal fight for me, whether any black person or white person or a member of the LGBT community actually benefits from my efforts. I'm fighting this because it's wrong, and I believe it's wrong, and I'm going to fight against it.
So how does a white person in America take that perspective that you just described and not come off as, oh, there's another white person trying to make this about them?
Ooh, yes, to avoid centering yourself in the work in a way that is to say, let me get all of the attention and accolades and awards for doing this really good work.
So that's the distinction there. Tell me what this white
centering piece is. I'm doing it because, and again, it's a fear thing. I want to get it right. I want to do a good job. A lot of us want to do a good job getting rid of something. And the difficulty is, we're all surviving systemic oppression. There are no awards for survival. We shouldn't be in a place where we're even having to survive. So when you engage in the work because this matters to you personally. Whether anyone were to see you doing it or not, I think all of our historical figures, Malcolm X, MLK, Bill Moore, John Brown, a white man who was the man behind Harper's Ferry, he recruited his 6 or 7 sons to do a revolt against slavery, all white men, and he was hung for treason. I think being able to understand that John Brown did it because he believed slavery was wrong, not because he was looking for Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or any other enslaved or free black person to say, hey, good job, John Brown. He did it because it was wrong. We have to understand that working for justice through merciful means, non-direct or direct, nonviolent demonstrations and actions like that, those are the right things to do to get rid of wrong and harmful systems.
I mentioned that the Pew Research Center recently put out a survey that found that a fairly large percentage of Americans, 1 in 5, believes that racism is not a problem in America. And I would imagine that a lot of those people also would reject the idea of white privilege. Mm-hmm. And they many of them are I mean, I'm guessing here, but I imagine many of them are white.
Yes.
And they look at their own lives and they say, I've worked really hard for everything that I have. I've had a lot of hard knocks. You know, I don't have I'm not wealthy. I haven't had privilege is not a word I would associate with my life.
Correct.
As a working class American,
Yes.
for example.
Yes.
So white privilege is meaningless. Like, the color of my skin has never done me any favors. Explain what you think about that viewpoint.
Well, if 1 out of 5 people don't believe racism is a problem, that means 4 out of 5 do. So if we're running into statistics that way, white privilege has become a very difficult buzzword for the work that we do in diversity and in inclusion work in higher education. We're always trying to adapt our language to bring as many people to the table for conversation as possible.
And white privilege is a toxic word that you try not to use
when
you're promoting diversity?
For me, it's getting to that point because I recognize how much it turns my students off. So often what I will say is, people who were enslaved worked really hard also. Were they able to get the same benefits that others of us who were not enslaved and work really hard do? This is not about working really hard. This is about, do you have access to resources that benefit from your very, very hard work? And it's also a very difficult and entwined conversation about class and race. MLK quotes a historian who wrote the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And he talks about how when he was, imprisoned at some point in time for a demonstration or march that he was doing, he got to talking with the prison guards that were there who were telling Martin Luther King, you guys got to stop all this marching, just go along to get along and behave and everything will be okay. And Martin Luther King says, I engaged them about their families, about their schools, about their children. They told me how much money they didn't make, how they were going hungry, how their families were suffering. And MLK says, you should be out there marching with me. We're fighting against a very similar system, but the only thing that has me in here and you out there is because you believe you're better because you're white. And that's something that white people are told, especially where class is concerned. There's a movie coming out, Best of Enemies. It's based on the true story of the Durham community, Durham, North Carolina. An activist and befriends a white man who's a member of the KKK. The black woman is out doing voter registrations, and she ends up interacting with this white male who chooses to align himself with the KKK. And one of the turning points, spoiler alert, for this discussion about their friendship, their best of enemies, is when the white man realizes that when he's at Klan meetings, he is welcomed and embraced by his brothers. But when he is on the streets and sees those same bankers and lawyers and city councilmen, they cross the street to get away from him. When the system of privilege and power abandoned that white man, he recognized that he was aligned with the wrong people. It's a similar conversation here. Yes, your white skin may not have done you any favors, but are you willing to engage and to explore the fact that what if it has? What if your white skin was used to keep my brown skin out of places? And if that were true, none of it's saying that you're a wrong person. It's saying you're benefiting from a system that was set up long before you took your first breath. And because you have that privilege, you actually now have leverage. You have access to something that I don't have. And if you can make space for me to be where you are, there are ways that I can also probably make space for someone else to be where I am. And so our privileges now become power.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people perceive the idea that if I acknowledge that I have benefited from white privilege, that I therefore must bear a burden of shame and guilt, that I should feel badly about this thing I got that I didn't work for, that I was just born with.
Absolutely.
Does guilt have to come along with acknowledging white privilege?
Guilt, yes. Shame, no. Shame says that something about you is wrong and terrible and unworthy of respect or unworthy and is unredeemable. Guilt says, I'm behaving in a manner contrary to who I really believe I am. Guilt will motivate you to make changes. Shame will not. And so this idea of a privilege shame, any of us can have it through skin privilege, through ability privilege, through class or educational privilege, through sexual orientation, gender identity, political, nation, any sort of privilege. There are so many identities that we have. All of our identities exist within us experiencing privilege and oppression. When we experience privilege and we feel guilty about that privilege, it just means, okay, what can I do to leverage this? Because privilege is it's not a use it or lose it kind of thing. I have it whether I leverage it or not.
Leverage it for what? Give me one specific example of of what someone could do to leverage the privilege that has come with the color of their skin.
Who do you bring with you to access the same resources that you don't think twice about?
Like what?
Like school. I think a very easy area is the schools that our kids attend. One of the things that I will do because I have class privilege that allows me during the workday to go and volunteer in my child's classroom, I tell the teachers, if there is a kiddo whose parent works and they can't come in, can I work with that kid? That's a simple way that I can leverage class, education, and time privilege that I have that other working parents might not have. It's an easy example. But a lot of us don't seem to think that we can do small, easy things like that. But we can, and it takes small, easy things to dismantle these systems of oppression that we all are living within.
I'm speaking with LaShawn Williams, who's a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. She teaches and writes about cross-cultural interaction. The Pew Research Center's recent survey found that views on this, whether racism is a problem, fall quite dramatically along party lines. So 24% of Republicans in this survey said that racism is a very big problem. That's 24%. Compared to 62% of Americans who believe that it's a problem, of Democrats in America who believe that it's a problem. So more than double.
Yes.
Why do you think that views on race would be tied up with politics at all?
It's our foundation of our country. From the 3/5 compromise that was settled that deemed our political representation for the North and the South when the Southerners wanted their enslaved humans to count for their numbers and representation to give them more representation in the Congress. The Northern representative said, well, then we're going to tax you based on representation as well. Southerners said, no, we want the numbers representation, but their property so far as taxes are concerned. And a 3/5 compromise was made that had enslaved Africans considered 3/5 of a person for taxation and for representation. So race is at the foundation of our political history here in the U.S., and so there's no surprise that it will find its way into our current political environment.
But is there a reason, though, why you think today that there's such a divide? I mean, we know that we're more polarized than we have been politically in at least 20 years. Democrats, people who identify as Democrats are, solidly, more solidly Democrat than ever before, and Republicans likewise.
Yes.
I guess a part of the question is, are we just, because we're just divided in general, like this also aligns with our views on race and whether or not it's a problem? I mean, is there something that's going on that's causing, Democrats to be more concerned about racism in America and Republicans to not be?
Well, race is one of the few things we think that we can see. I can look into a room and I can discern differences in phenotypical, stereotypical racial characteristics. And because it's part of our political environment and our political conversations, whether it's through dog whistle politics and code words that are used to say negative things about people, or whether it's very blatant discussions of claiming nationalism instead of using the word patriotism, we're entering a conversation that is drawing lines in the sand and creating these litmus tests for who is a real, worthy, respectable member of this society, who is a real American. And when you've had political shifts, one of the major conversations that will come up, we'll talk about how Abraham Lincoln and others during that era were Republicans, and that's sometimes used as a conversation point to say why Black people should be more Republican than they are Democrat, because Andrew Jackson was a Democrat and Democrats were racist at that point in time. What we failed to also discuss is the shift in party philosophy and party ideology that happened from the 19th century, from the Great Depression and on. And we fail to study our history. We fail to study how the Social Security Act of the 1930s included so many people, but it excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which were predominantly people of color. Black domestic workers and immigrant Mexican agricultural laborers were not included in the Social Security Act and did not benefit from the safety net. So if you follow the policy and you understand how we've enacted policies in ways that have created and continued and maintained division, then all you're seeing today is just explicit recognition of what has existed invisibly from our foundings up until now.
Professor Williams, how do you think the national discussion that we have been having for several years now about white police officers using violence against Black men, often unarmed Black men, how has that affected race relations among everyday Americans today?
It puts a lot of us in fear of each other. It puts a lot of us in a place where we feel like we have to prove our worth to each other before we can even engage in a healthy manner. It's unfortunate that we have these demonstrations happening within our communities, demonstrations of violence, demonstrations of resistance. People are asking to be heard. And Martin Luther King said a riot is the language of the unheard. It also goes back to how officers and law enforcement are trained to engage with people. For me, as a mental health professional, we know how important it is to de-escalate and to engage folks. More officers and departments are taking mental health engagement seriously, but it's a long process because of how we associate law and order through Richard Nixon's administration and crime and punishment as opposed to protecting and serving. What would it look like to protect and serve?
Do you think that I have wondered if, for example, with when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and then also if we even think about the protests that Colin Kaepernick began and NFL players kneeling during the national anthem in sign of protest, calling for more work to be done around both the issue of police force and racial discrimination in general. And then we see that conversation. It seems to me like oftentimes these issues where race is underneath it, end up getting interpreted as being about something else, and that's the
Yes.
thing we focus on. So, for example, with the police force conversation, there are people, I'm sure, who feel like I'm not going to support Black Lives Matter because they're anti-police officer. This is about not supporting law enforcement. Or, we saw that very clearly with the NFL protests. People saying it's wrong to kneel during the national anthem because that's disrespecting our country and disrespecting our soldiers, and not, or somehow like not thinking about it, or kind of ignoring the underlying race question that is beneath all of these, both of those cases. Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think that we're just afraid again of the race part, and so it's easier to define it as I'm opposed to the kneeling because I don't believe that blacks should be discriminated against, but I'm opposed to the kneeling because it's against, because it's anti-patriotic.
Yeah, that's lazy patriotism for us, because if we want to see things only as we see it in a way that absolves us of any sort of responsibility or commitment to community, that's what an alignment with white supremacist types of thinking and the idea that white supremacy kind of changes the rules of the game whenever it sees fit, we're victims of that. If we're willing to all of a sudden make kneeling a symbol of disrespect, whenever there's an injured player on the field, the teams will both kneel until the injured player is removed. People kneel to show respect to deity and to leaderships and, kingdoms and whatnot. People kneel to propose. People kneel to worship. How does kneeling all of a sudden become a negative thing when I'm uncomfortable with why you're kneeling? That's what we're not getting to. And being able to say, I don't want Black people being discriminated against, but I'm going to ignore the very examples of discrimination that you're showing me, is an incongruence. And it's a lazy civic engagement. It's lazy humanity for me to choose to see and value only the parts of your humanity that I think are important, as opposed to all of your humanity. I'd want the same thing to happen for me that I want for you. And that's why you'll see Black Lives Matter supporting police brutality against more than just Black people.
Opposing, you say?
Oh yes, well, and they'll protest against police brutality when it's happening to non-Black people. And so, but the other thing about it is we wait and we try to see if people are going to say white lives matter, then will they show up for white lives that are damaged and impacted by police brutality as well, or not? There are some really interesting conversations that we have to play within these political gymnastics and these political games of switching the rules and this bait and switch. And it's like being in a house of mirrors at times. You don't know what you're walking into, because when you think you're walking in one direction towards unity, towards conversation, towards community and connection, it switches and you run into a mirror and it's like, oh, I'm not getting the support and the help that I thought I was because you are uncomfortable.
How do we get that unity and conversation and support? And does it help to call out inadvertent racist attitudes, racial comments, to sort of say, hey, I know you don't mean it, but that's racist?
Yeah, it helps to call attention to those things. And relationship is at the heart of all of it. Because if I'm with someone that I really care about and I know that we can have that conversation, I actually might miss the first time they do it. I might be scared to engage it. But when I value the relationship, I might come back to it and say, remember that conversation we were having like 2 weeks ago and you said this, that, and the other? Did you know that it could have come off really racist, and it came off really racist towards me? Can we talk about that? Because I really don't think you intended it that way, but it really hurt me. And it's that one-on-one conversation. But it's also great if we can see it in leadership. There's a congressman running for office in Texas who was engaged about NFL players kneeling during the anthem. Beto O'Rourke, I think is his name. And he engaged the conversation so well by how masterfully he used history and how easily he implicated himself. He said, Colin Kaepernick and others are upset with people like me who are not doing enough and doing enough to speak up and to stand up against these things. And by owning it and discussing and talking his way through it, he set a really great example for other people who identify as he does to say, oh, well, if this is what it looks like for a white person speaking up against police brutality, speaking up against or in favor of Black Lives Matter, here's maybe how I can do it too. I don't know that white people feel like they have enough examples of how to do it that way, because the examples that they do have, JFK, Bill Moore, John Brown, all of those men were killed for standing up against and fighting against white supremacy. And that is daunting. it is also part of what many communities of color, Black, brown, and otherwise, have experienced, is our leaders being killed for standing up against power structures. And it's hard to dismantle the master's home with the master's tools, said Audre Lorde, but we've got to figure out ways to do this. We're 50 years later from a statement that you could have just read, and it could have been the entirety of this show. Why do we tolerate oppression? Why do we tolerate inequalities when we are the ones who really could change it?
LaShawn Williams is a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to those of you who've joined us online for this conversation. You've been watching special coverage from Brigham Young University of Kerner Plus 50, a conversation about race in America 50 years after the Kerner Commission report. Coming up, Othello Richards speaks with film producer and author Tamu Smith and Brigham Young University history professor Cameron McCoy. They'll discuss what's been done since the Kerner Commission report and what hasn't been done. I'm Julie Rose. You can join me for Top of Mind weekdays from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Channel 143 or byuradio.org.